You can hate Israel. You can disagree with everything Israel does. You can disagree with the right of Israel to exist and still be able to acknowledge that all the hostages should be released. 72% in Gaza support Hamas after October 7th and 82% in the West Bank. That's the reality we're operating in.
This is a Visegrad 24 series about the Israel-Hamas War.
Okay, we're joined here today with Emily Schrader, a prolific journalist, TV host, social activist. Anything else that I missed?
Many, many hats. I'm sure there are things you forgot.
Anything else you want to add on? Okay, great. So since October 7th, you've been covering a lot on, as journalist, what's going on here. Tell me about some of the work that you've been doing.
I mean, I think that first and foremost, I want to say that from the perspective of a journalist, I think this is probably one of the most difficult situations I've been in, because the exposure to extremism that's constantly in your face as a result of social media is unparalleled. And I've covered the Taliban in Afghanistan. I've covered Russia and Ukraine. I've covered, what's happening in Syria even. And I covered ISIS. I've never seen the level of evil that we've seen from Hamas in terms of marketing their hatred, their terrorism. I mean, it's really unparalleled, except perhaps by maybe the Nazis or, the modern Nazis, the Islamic Republic of Iran. And that's sort of the main places we see this level of hatred. So as a journalist, it's been quite a challenge to deal with that, even myself. But I'm sure you've seen journalists who are on the ground, war correspondents, especially Israeli journalists, have, the first few weeks, everybody was breaking down in tears in broadcasts. So it's a different dynamic than I've dealt with, because it's like my war, as an Israeli journalist, it's a little bit different. It hits a little bit harder. There are people who work at the channel I work at who were killed, people who have been taken hostage. So it's personal in a way that I haven't experienced so far. But it just makes me all the more resolute to continue to speak out about what's happening.
Do you think that it's more difficult because of social media, or do you feel like there's a media bias that also change? Like, what comes first?
Oof, that's hard, because it's both. I mean, I think mentally, I don't know if it's as a journalist or just as a human being, social media is more difficult today. I mean, what we're seeing from this content it's crazy. I mean, I'm sure you've seen some of it, and that's not even the worst of the worst. I attended one of the first briefings of this 45-minute film that the Israeli government put together. I can't unsee it. And I actually don't recommend that anyone see it who doesn't have to or doesn't really need to for their job or whatever. It's a lot. It's a lot to see that level of inhumanity. And so from a professional media perspective, it's incredibly difficult, and also from social media. But there is another element when it comes to the media that we've been dealing with throughout this conflict, and that is the bias in general from the international community. And this is something that's been endlessly infuriating to look at, because the way that this conflict is reported isn't let's ensure the hostages are released and then talk about a ceasefire or some type of negotiation, which, by the way, I wouldn't agree with either, because I really believe this terrorist organization needs to be eliminated for good. However, I would be willing to entertain that kind of discussion if the priority in the international community was demanding the release of innocent hostages, which include a 1-year-old baby, for example, or an 85-year-old man. I mean, it's insanity what's happening. And the fact that we're even having a conversation about, like, oh, is it genocide? Is it not genocide? Should there be ceasefire? Should there not be ceasefire? That's not the point. That's not what we should be talking about here. Over 100 days, and there are still over 130 hostages in Gaza being held by a U.S. and European designated terrorist organization. That's madness. And the fact that nobody is outraged, and none of the mainstream media are even making this the central point of this war, is inexcusable. Because when these same issues happened with Boko Haram, or even when they happened with the Iranian regime in the last year, which we'll talk about later, but the media, at least, they covered it, and they spoke about the atrocities that were happening, and they put their outrage in the right place. That's not what happens with this conflict. They've completely politicized the issue. They've completely politicized the kidnapping of human beings and using them as leverage for political gain by a terrorist organization. Like, it's crazy that people aren't all united on this issue, because you can hate Israel. You can disagree with everything Israel does. You can disagree with the right of Israel to exist and still be able to acknowledge that all the hostages should be released and that this is a disgusting crime against humanity. And yet, that's not what we're seeing. And it's very difficult to accept in the modern era, in year 2024, that at its core, at least part of this is just anti-Semitism. There really is no other explanation for this irrational animosity towards the Jewish state, and only the Jewish state.
Right. You see it also with how things are, named. Like, let's say Hamas isn't called a terror organization by lots of media outlets.
So this has been a huge issue. This has been a huge issue with BBC. And the reason it's especially insane is because the UK designates Hamas as a terrorist organization. But no, BBC knows better. So instead, they decided that their editorial policy was to say Hamas militants, or a number of other terms. Yeah, gunmen, whatever. Never terrorists. And I think that this is just completely intellectually dishonest, because even your own country is saying they are terrorists. Not to mention the fact that they put their terrorist activities on display for everyone to see. They live streamed it. They uploaded videos to people's Facebooks killing them so that their families could see. Like, the level of depravity is unmatched, and yet still they won't call a spade a spade. This is journalistic malpractice, honestly, and they should be sued for it. And they're not the only ones. The other major incident that happened was with the bombing of the hospital in the Gaza Strip early on in the war. And immediately Hamas went to the media and said, Israeli airstrikes hit a hospital and there are 500 injured. This was within the first couple of minutes. Within the first 15 minutes, 500 were injured. Okay, sure. I'm sure on 9/11, the Americans couldn't count, the 2,900 plus casualties for months. And yet they were able to find 500 bodies in the first 15 minutes. So already they're lying just on basic logic. But that didn't stop AP, Reuters, New York Times, BBC, everyone, Washington Post, all of the mainstream international media, both print and broadcast, went with it. They went with the claim of Hamas without even checking, without getting an answer from the IDF. And then it turns out a couple days later, and then as we found out a couple weeks later, that not only did Israel not issue any kind of airstrike in the area at the time, but Islamic Jihad, the other Iranian-backed terrorist organization in Gaza, fired a rocket which hit the hospital parking lot, not the actual hospital, and between 40 and 50 casualties were the actual number in this attack. But it doesn't matter, because that lie had already traveled all the way, not halfway, all the way around the world on this issue. And this is the same irresponsible journalism that we've continued to see from sources like BBC and the New York Times.
You've spoken about the connection between Hamas and Iran, how it's Iranian-backed, and you've also been doing work with the Iranian civilians and with communities internationally. Yeah. Do you want to share a bit about that work?
Yeah, I do a lot of women's activism. I've been covering the issues in Iran for a while, since unfortunately they've been dealing with it for 44 years. And then, of course, with everything that happened in Afghanistan, I was very vocal on these issues. But in the last year, I have been very involved in the women life freedom push and the call for regime change in Iran. And of course, there are a number of different reasons for that. Yeah. First and foremost, ideological, because I think that the Iranian people want and deserve freedom, and the women are in an especially egregious situation there. But also, of course, in terms of global politics, the biggest problem in the Middle East, and ironically, the biggest murderer of Arab Muslims, is the Iranian regime. It's the Islamic Republic. And I think that people don't realize this in the Western world a lot. And another thing that's sort of come to the forefront as a result of this war is that we see thousands, tens of thousands of Iranians, both diaspora Iranians who are living abroad, and of course Iranians inside Iran, who are siding with Israel, which is supposedly, the little Satan. They're done. These people are fed up with the Islamic Republic of Iran. They want regime change. They don't want reforms. They don't want any kind of change other than a systemic regime change. And instead of the West sort of having their back on this, they've sort of been left to their own devices. And so I think that they are looking to Israel as an example of a people who took matters into their own hands, who declared themselves a state, who fought for their existence, who have stood up against enemies throughout all of human history, and they admire Israel. And they want Israel to help them. I can't tell you how many messages I get on a daily basis of Iranians inside Iran who are messaging me saying, I'm Iranian and I want to join the IDF. Or even more bizarrely, I'm Iranian, please bomb IRGC bases in Iran. And I've been like, I'm not sure that's the best approach right now, nor am I the correct address for that request. But it just speaks to the fact that, they're very clear about right and wrong. And I think that it's coming at a time when a lot of people in the Western world and societies that claim that they support liberal values and that they support freedom of speech, freedom of press, democracy, they are really willing to fight for it. And here you have 80 million people, or almost 80 million people, because it is a majority, unlike Gaza, it is a majority of the people who are against the regime who are willing to die for those freedoms. You have 16-year-old girls who are who would rather die than live under the Islamic Republic of Iran because they know what the alternative is. And the byproduct of that when it comes to the issues in Israel is that they know what Hezbollah is, and they know what Hamas is, and they know that their money that's supposed to go to the economy in Iran and the people of Iran is instead going to terrorist organizations like Hamas, like Islamic Jihad, like Hezbollah, like the Houthis in Yemen. And the regime has twisted what was a very incredible and rich nation and twisted it into something that's one of the greatest forces of evil in our time. And as a result of that, the silver lining is that the people are with us. I would say almost 100% the Iranian people are with us.
Why don't you think that message comes across in Western media, press?
Well, I think the narrative with Iran is a little bit similar to the narrative with Israel and the Palestinians. The media has an exact idea of how they want to present this. One is strong, one is weak, one is oppressed, one is oppressor. And anything that's sort of nuanced or goes against that narrative isn't really something they want to promote. It's the same thing with Iran. It's complex. There's a lot of history, There's a lot of tensions and different angles to this issue. And it's very difficult for them to understand that something so far away is so relevant to them. The mistake that they're making in this is that by not educating the Western public, whether it be in Europe or the United States or Canada, the people don't understand why what happens in Iran and what Iran is doing in the Middle East is going to reach them as well. And of course it is, because they've stated explicitly that's what their agenda is. In what way? They've stated that their goal, I said Israel's the little Satan, right? They say that the United States is the great Satan. They've been very explicit in their intent to ultimately destroy the Western world. That is what their goal is. That is the end game of Hamas as well. They're all a part of this octopus, we'll say, with many, many arms around the world that are engaging in terrorist activity. And by the way, also criminal activity. If you look at Latin America and also a lot of Europe, the money laundering and the affiliation with criminal gangs, with cartels in Latin America, it's been an extremely dangerous force throughout the world. And people aren't recognizing it as such.
Right. I always think when you put it Israel is the oppressor and Gaza is the oppressed, it makes sense when you're looking at it through that lens. But if you zoom out a tiny bit, you'll see we're surrounded by enemy states that really want us to be destroyed.
Yeah. The truth is Iran is the oppressor. And I guess I should specify, because it's not really even Iran. It's the Islamic Republic. It's this regime. That is who the oppressor is in the Middle East. And, I actually had I wrote an open letter together with an Iranian Muslim woman, another activist like me who's based in Europe. And we had women leaders from throughout the Middle East sign on to this. It's condemning the Islamic Republic and Hamas for their crimes against humanity, and specifically their use of sexual violence as a method of war, which is what we saw from Hamas, and of course also what we've seen from the Islamic Republic in Iran. This is a tool that they are using now in order to silence dissent from the protesters just from last year. So this is a systemic policy, has been since 1979 when they took over. And I wrote this open letter together. I have over 60 signatures now. And this is the part that shocked me, is I initially wanted it only to be from Israelis and Iranians, both Arab Israelis and Jewish Israelis and Iranians. And I had so many requests from Arab women in the Middle East that we were like, okay, let's just do it for the whole Middle East. So we have women from 12 countries in the Middle East. We have Shia, Sunni, secular, religious, wears a hijab, doesn't wear a hijab, atheist, Iranian, Yazidi, Afghan, the number of people who have zero, people who don't even like Israel. I have Palestinians who signed on to it as well. And we are united in this because our enemy is the same, which is a strange place to be, because if you think about a Palestinian woman who is from Gaza, by the way, and myself, what do we actually have in common in terms of enemy? And the reality is Iran and frankly, Hamas. Hamas is not a friend to the Palestinian people. They are awful to the Palestinian people. And that is because they're acting as a proxy of the Islamic Republic of Iran, who doesn't care about the Palestinian people. We care about the Palestinian people more than they do.
How does the rhetoric of the Islamic regime differ from the actual civilians in Iran? You said the majority is against it.
Yeah, definitely. So in Gaza, we have this kind of
and how does that differ in Gaza?
Yeah, this dystopian situation where, and also the West Bank, unfortunately, according to recent polls, Arab polls, by the way, not Israeli, that stated that I think it was 72% in Gaza support Hamas, like recently, after October 7th, and 82% in the West Bank. So it's unfortunate, but the majority of Palestinian society, for whatever reason, does support Hamas right now. That's the reality we're operating in. Now, of course, that doesn't mean we should kill all of them. I'm not that kind of person when it comes to warfare. We need to take every effort that we can in order to preserve civilian life, regardless of what they might happen to think. Do is something else, but think. So that should be said first and foremost. But the situation in Iran is pretty much the polar opposite. I would say between 80 and 90% of the public opposes strongly the Islamic Republic. The difference is that the Islamic Republic are smart. They're incredibly smart. And they have built a system that's very, very difficult to dismantle internally. And they have also, like I said, an octopus, extended their arms into all different kinds of areas. And one of the ways they've been most effective is with the IRGC. And while the United States has declared the IRGC as a terrorist organization, Europe has not. It's been one of the issues that I lobbied on throughout last year, actually all over the world, but in particular in Europe. And the reason Europe doesn't really want to label the IRGC as a terrorist organization is because it makes it difficult for them, and they have to do a lot of work to enforce the law. It's an economic interest, and especially after the sanctions on Russia, the economy isn't very good when it comes to energy issues, so they don't want to mess with Iran. They don't want to ruffle any feathers, or at least they didn't last year. Hopefully now it's different. We'll see. With the strikes on the Houthis,
they'll see, okay, this is becoming something dangerous.
But the IRGC has implemented themselves as a major economic player, especially in Germany and other Western European countries. And they use these countries for money laundering, and they set up legitimate businesses that are funneling funds for other things. So it's difficult to bring this regime down in a peaceful way. I do believe it can be done, but it's very, very difficult. And so the world really needs to build like an ironclad coalition when they're ready to deal with this issue, and they must sooner rather than later, because the longer that we put it off, the longer that we sort of look the other way and try to make interim deals for nuclear programs and all of the stuff that has been tried, the worse it's going to be in the end. The more people are going to die. And if you don't believe me, the best example is what's happening now in Gaza, because we didn't deal with the problem, and that's just a micro scale. We didn't deal with the problem in Gaza. We didn't deal with Hamas. We had multiple operations. We had 2008, 2012, 2014, 2021, and now it's come back to bite us, in in the tahat. So we should have dealt with it before, and it's sad to me to see, because there are many people, thousands of people, innocent Palestinians who are dead as a result of our moral failing to deal with this in the first place. And of course, there are Israelis who are dead as a result of our failure to deal with this in the first place. And I don't want to see that anymore. And that's one of the reasons that I'm very, very vocal on the Iranian issue, because we have a way now to avoid that.
Got to get to the root.
Yes. But until we do, it's not going to change.
Also, what do you think is the way to get to the root? To just financially boycott? What's the end game?
So there's a few things. First of all, I think at an individual level, more people in the Western world need to use their democratic rights that those in Iran don't have the real privilege of doing, to speak to literally any elected official who will listen about this issue, because it affects all of us. And if it doesn't today, it will tomorrow. So we need to place pressure on elected officials to have zero tolerance policy for Iran. And what does that mean? That doesn't mean go bomb Iran tomorrow. That's not what I'm advocating. we need to enforce sanctions that are already on the books. We need to pass more sanctions. We need Magnitsky sanctions, targeted sanctions against certain individuals. The United States and also Europe need to have a zero tolerance policy when it comes to IRGC officials and their families. Some of them are even living in Washington, D.C. There's a video of one of the senior IRGC officials' daughters, her wedding video. No hijab, nothing, alcohol everywhere, but no one cares because she's associated with the regime. So the hypocrisy on this needs to be exposed. They need to be exported, what's the word? Extradited.
Yeah.
Exported, I guess.
That sounds good.
Extradited from the United States, from Europe, when it's proven that they are affiliated, which is something the U.S. especially has been very weak on. They didn't, and also Europe. They don't really want to enforce these things because it upsets people. And frankly, I think that the United States, which doesn't really have diplomatic relations right now, but Europe needs to expel ambassadors. They need to cut off diplomatic relations, and they need to say that this regime is not a legitimate regime, because there is a credible argument for that with the way that they took power. There's no actual constitutional basis for what they did. And the constitutional referendum that the Islamic Republic put into place when they first came into power, it was voted on. But you can't really do anything with that, you know? And one more thing I want to add about the Iranian Revolution and Iranians until today, and that is that they have been close allies with the PLO and Yasser Arafat from day one. That is their buddies from day one, who trained them, who worked together. And upon speaking with Iranians on the ground in Iran, they know this. So they have a special animosity towards Palestinian, leadership, if you can even call it leadership these days, as a result of that. Because who was on the ground in Iran during the revolution fighting against some of the army that was trying to push back the Islamists who ultimately succeeded and took power? The PLO. Yasser Arafat was one of the first honored guests to come to Tehran after the revolution. He was accompanied on what was the Shah's private, military jet from the Air Force that had just been taken over by the Islamic Republic. And then when he came to Iran, they took him all around the new Islamic Republic, and they dedicated the Israeli embassy that the protesters had ransacked to the PLO and declared it the PLO embassy, where there's a video of Yasser Arafat giving a speech from the balcony of the former Israeli embassy. All of that at the behest of the Islamic Republic of Iran. So from day one, these people have supported terror, they have been the terrorists, and they have done everything in their power in order to advance that extremism that ultimately harms Palestinians and everyone else in the region.
Yeah, I want to ask you one last question about the relationship between Russia and Iran. It's not a question, it's still elaborate.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you a funny story. I actually did an interview on RT this week, and the second that I started speaking about Iran, he got very, very testy with me. They do not like anyone criticizing Iran, which just speaks to the fact that Russia, which of course is the state sponsor of RT, is in bed with Iran. And they have, for whatever reason, they have been collaborating with Iran. They have been using Iranian suicide drones in order to murder and maim innocent Ukrainians, civilians, not military, civilians. Iran and Russia have been some of the worst actors on human rights issues in the world. So it's logical that they would help each other. We also see China helping both Russia and Iran and vice versa. So this is sort of a new axis of evil, so to speak. And I think that this is all the more reason why we need unity and clarity, moral clarity in the West, both from leadership and from the people. And right now that message isn't really getting through. It's not about hating Iran or hating Palestinians or hating anything like that. I don't hate anyone except maybe the Ayatollah who deserves it, and Yahya Sinwar.
There are people who deserve some hate. It's okay. Don't be so kind.
But we do need to take action. We do need to take action, or it's going to get worse. And I think people really need to understand that. Even by looking at the last 20, 30 years of history, you can see what's happening. There's a reason that, Iranian women and all kinds of Muslim women throughout the Middle East are screaming from the rooftops about the dangers of the Islamic Republic of Iran and its proxies, especially its impact on women and children who do pay the price for wars disproportionately, if you're looking at history. So more than ever, I think that we need to stand united, both in Europe, in the United States, Canada, Australia. Every democratic country should be united against the war crimes of Russia, against the war crimes of China, and the human rights violations of China and against the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Thank you so much, Emily. This is incredible.
Thank you.